Hello, this is Mr. Corkill, and I am going to reread Chapter 6 for a few people who were absent that day. I don't always read the chapters, but I read this one for you after break. So let's get to it. This is from Chapter 6, 5.03.6. 5.03.6. Make sure you shared this with me, and if you work with any other teachers, make sure that you share with them. Chapter 6. Douglas went to go live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld in Baltimore. My new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door. Now remember, mistress doesn't mean a girlfriend. Mistress means the wife to the slave owner. So his new master's wife is the mistress, Mrs. Auld. A woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage, she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. It means that she owned her own business before she married Mr. Auld. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. All right, that means that she was ignorant to slavery, or she was ignorant to being a slave owner. She was very kind. She's not cruel like other slave owners. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My early instruction was all out of place. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested toward her. All right, that means that Mrs. Auld didn't want him to bow down to her. Slaves are used to not looking white people in the face, into the eyes. They're used to just keeping their chin down and not looking up. Miss Auld didn't like that. She didn't want that. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. Right? To her, it wasn't bad manners for a slave to look their master into the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music. Well, she's being portrayed and characterized as an ignorant slave owner. All right? Paragraph 2. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice made all of sweet accord change to one of harsh and horrid discord. And that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. So Mrs. Auld had this kind heart. She was ignorant to being a slave owner, but after a while, power poisons her. Power poisons her, and she becomes cruel. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. She started teaching for young Frederick the alphabet. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. She's teaching him to read. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further. All right, so Mr. Auld finds Mrs. Auld teaching young Frederick how to read, and Mr. Auld gets furious, telling her that among other things, that it was unlawful. It's against the law to teach a slave to read or write. You can get in trouble, and the slave, young Frederick, who's between 5 and 7, can be hanged for learning to read or write. As well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. Why would it be unsafe? To use his own words, further, he said, if you give a N-word an inch, he will take an L. In other words, if you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. N-word should know nothing but to obey his master, to do so as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best N-word again in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that N-word, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. All right, so Mr. Auld says that not only is it against the law to teach a slave to read, not only is it against the law, it's unsafe to the white people, because if they learn to read and write, the slaves will begin to disobey their masters, and it would spoil them. In other words, knowledge would spoil them, because the slaves are ignorant. They are kept ignorant on purpose. They're kept ignorant and dehumanized on purpose so that they don't rebel against their owners, right? If you teach them how to read, there's no keeping them. They're going to understand that there's better things out there. They're going to escape. They'll never want to be a slave anymore. They'll become unmanageable. They'll rebel and have no value of their masters anymore. And it wouldn't do them any good, but a great deal of harm, because their lives could be in danger if they ran away. It would make them unhappy, discontented, wanting to end slavery altogether. These words for Douglass were an epiphany. It was an aha moment. It changed his life as a child. These words sank deep into my heart and stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining the dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understandings had struggled, but struggled in vain. Frederick Douglass could not understand the power that the white man had over the slave. He didn't understand why they could get away with it. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. All right? He finally understood the black man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Frederick Douglass knew that being kept ignorant is what keeps slaves slaves. If they were to learn to read and write, it would be the pathway from slavery to freedom for them. Knowledge, or education, is the pathway to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction by which the merest accident I had gained from my master. Even though his master told him some horrible things, I mean, how many times did he use the N-word? Over and over and over again. How many times did he use it? A lot. So even though these words were cruel, Frederick Douglass was very happy that he heard his master say these horrible words to him. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and fixed purpose. All right? No matter what happens, Frederick Douglass is going to teach himself to read and write, even without the aid of a teacher, like Mrs. Auld. Whatever cost of trouble to learn to read and write, Douglass is going to do this, because he could be hanged. Remember, he could be hanged for learning to read or write, but it doesn't matter to him. He's still going to learn to read or write. He has fortitude. He will not give up no matter how bad it is. Fortitude. To learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction, the terrible things that Mr. Auld told Douglass, young Frederick Douglass, served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. Yes, Mr. Auld was right in Frederick Douglass's eyes. It gave me the best assurance, Douglas writes, that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the result which he said would flow from teaching me to read. Little does Mr. Auld know that he just gave Frederick Douglass the key to knowledge and how to escape slavery. What he most dreaded, right? What the man hated, what the man was afraid of the most, Douglas desired. That I most desired. What he most loved, slavery, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, slaves learning to read, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read, it's unlawful, they'll rebel, only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, in learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. Paragraph 4, last paragraph. I had resided but a short time in Baltimore before I observed a marked difference in the treatment of slaves from that which I had witnessed in the country. A city slave is almost a free man compared with a slave on the plantation. He is much better fed, much better clothed, and enjoys privileges. A city slave is much better fed and clothed and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. There is a vestige of decency and a sense of shame that does much to curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so commonly enacted upon the plantation. He is a desperate slaveholder who will shock the humanity of his non-slave-holding neighbors with the cries of his lacerated slave. So the city slaves were to be treated well, and if you didn't treat your slaves well and you lived in the city, people looked down on you, all right? And the plantation was different. On the plantation, it was totally different. Few slaves are willing to incur the odium. Odium means hatred. The odio, hate, odio, odium. Few are willing to incur the odium to the reputation of being a cruel master. And above all things, they would not be known as not giving a slave enough to eat. All right? So they're supposed to treat their slaves well and supposed to feed them well. Every city slaveholder is anxious to have it known of him that he feeds his slaves well, and it is due to them to say that most of them do give their slaves enough to eat. Most of them give their slaves enough to eat. There are, however, some painful exceptions to this rule. Directly opposite to us on Philpott Street lived Mr. Thomas Hamilton. He owned 2 slaves. Their names were Henrietta and Mary. Henrietta was about 22 years of age and Mary was about 14. And of all the mangled, mangled means twisted and torn up and lacerated, and emaciated creatures. Emaciated means that they've been starved to where their face gets real thin, their body gets real thin, emaciated. And of all the mangled and emaciated creatures I ever looked upon, these 2 were the most so. His heart must be harder than stone that could look upon these unmoved, right? You have no heart if you looked upon these 2 slaves and didn't feel sympathy for them. The head, neck, and shoulders of Mary were literally cut to pieces. Cut to pieces. I have frequently felt her head and found it nearly covered with festering sores. Festering means that they're infected, right? Infected sores. Caused by the lash, caused by the whip of her cruel mistress. Mistress as in the owner's wife, the slave owner's wife, the master's wife. It's the master's wife who is beating these 2 slaves, Henrietta and Mary. I do not know that her master ever whipped her, but I have been an eyewitness to the cruelty of Mrs. Hamilton. I used to be in Mrs. Hamilton's house nearly every day. Mrs. Hamilton used to sit in a large chair in the middle of the room with a heavy cowskin, a whip, always by her side, and scarce an hour passed during the day but was marked by the blood of one of these slaves. The girls seldom passed her without her saying, and Mrs. Hamilton would say, "Move faster, you black gip," at the same time giving them a blow with a cowskin with a whip over their head and shoulders, often drawing the blood. She would then say, "Take that, you black gip," continuing, "If you don't move faster, I'll move you." Added to the cruel lashings to which these slaves were subjected, they were kept nearly half starved. So they're always getting whipped and they're half starved. They seldom knew what it was to eat a full meal. I have seen Mary contending, that means competing, right? Fighting. I've seen Mary fighting with the pigs for the offal, for the leftovers, for the food thrown into the streets, right? The garbage. So Mary fights with the pigs in the garbage that's thrown out on the streets. So much was Mary kicked and cut to pieces that she was oftener called pecked than by her name. So for the questions, you are integrating quotes. All right. According to Douglas, which textual evidence from paragraph 1 best supports the fact that his new mistress, Mrs. Auld, was ignorant about dealing with slaves? You have to find the quote that proves that Mrs. Auld is ignorant in dealing with slaves. Well, ignorant means you don't know something. It doesn't mean you're dumb, but it just means you don't know. You're not educated about it. So if we look up here, my new mistress proved to be all she appeared. I first met her at the door, a woman she's kind as heart. She'd never had a slave under her control previously to myself. Okay, that's part of it. All right, she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was by trade a weaver and constant application. Okay, and this part. She had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. All right, that's the quote we're going to use, the first part and the second part here. You must integrate the quotes. So in integrating the quotes, you may put, in proving that his new mistress, Mrs. Auld, was ignorant about dealing with slaves, Douglas writes, she had never had a slave under her control previously. And then you put 3 dots for ellipses, because we skipped some parts of the quote, of the paragraph. She had been in good degree preserved from the blighting, dehumanizing effects of slavery. Or you can simply write, Douglas writes, and then you put the quote. All right, this is the end of this video. And I'm going to post it.